Most leaders try to diagnose culture by asking people how they feel. They run engagement surveys, they schedule listening sessions, they try to read the mood of the organization. But culture problems rarely appear first in feelings. They appear in behavior patterns. And if you know what signals to look for, you can often diagnose the real issue in just about 10 minutes. In most organizations, three signals quietly appear before leaders realize something is wrong. One of them is usually missed completely. We will come back to that in a moment. In the previous episode, we talked about the four mechanisms that shape behavior inside organizations: priorities, decision rights, consequences, recognition. Today, we are looking at something different: how to spot the signals early and quickly identify which mechanism might actually be creating the problem. Because culture problems rarely start dramatically, they start quietly. What culture problems actually look like? In most organizations, culture problems don't begin with conflict or crisis. They begin with small patterns. Work slows down a little, problems appear later than they should, standards start to vary from one team to another. Individually, if we look at that, it feels like a small operational issue. But when the same pattern repeats across teams, something more important is happening. The system is producing behavior that was not intended. That's usually the moment leaders start saying something like this: something feels off in the culture. But the culture itself is not mysterious. It's simply behavior repeating inside a system. And behavior usually leaves signals. And the first signal most organizations notice is friction. Friction appears when work feels harder than it should. Projects move slower than expected. Teams spend more time coordinating work than actually completing it. Tasks are repeated because expectations were not clear the first time. Everyone is working hard, but progress feels strangely slow. When friction appears consistently, it often means something in the system is interfering with execution. Sometimes priorities are competing, sometimes ownership is unclear, sometimes teams are navigating complexity that should not exist. But friction alone doesn't always tell you where the problem sits, because friction can mean something very different depending on the second signal. And the second signal is much quieter. What it is? Silence. Problems appear late, risks surface only when deadlines are missed. Meetings appear calm on the surface, but real concerns are discussed privately afterward. People follow decisions, but they don't challenge them. At first glance, silence can look like alignment, but often it means something else. People have learned that raising issues early is uncomfortable, risky, or simply ineffective. So they wait. And the longer problems stay unspoken, the more expensive they become. Silence usually appears when people are unsure how escalation will be received, or when past experience has taught them that speaking up doesn't improve the outcome. And when silence appears alongside friction, leaders often start seeing a third signal. This is the signal that most leaders underestimate. And what it is? Drift. Standards begin to vary. Some teams enforce expectations consistently, others don't. Some individuals carry significant responsibility, while others contribute far less. What happens over time? Over time, expectations become unclear. The organization slowly stops reinforcing what actually matters. Drift rarely happens suddenly. It happens gradually when valued behavior is not consistently reinforced. People begin to adjusting their effort, not because they lack commitment, but because the system no longer clearly distinguishes what matters from what doesn't. And when friction, silence, and drift appear together, leaders often interpret the problem emotionally. They assume issue is motivation, but behavior patterns usually have a different cause. Now, how to interpret the signals? A single signal rarely tells you the whole story. What matters is the pattern. For example, if you see friction and constant escalation, the issue often sits in decision rights. Too many decisions travel through the system before work can move forward. If you see silence and late surprises, the issue often sits in consequences. People have learned that raising problems early doesn't lead to constructive outcomes. If you see drift and uneven standards, the issue often sits in recognition. The organization may be rewarding, maybe visibility, responsiveness, or activity instead of ownership and delivery. And when friction combines with drift, it often signals conflicting priorities. The signals don't give you the final answer, but they tell you where to start looking for. And that's where many leaders make a mistake. Why culture is often misdiagnosed? When leaders notice friction, silence, or drift, they often interpret the issue emotionally. That's why they assume the problem is engagement or motivation. So the response becomes maybe more communication campaigns, workshops, or new initiatives. Those are often start with energy, we all know, but the behavior patterns remain there because behavior rarely changes through messaging alone. If the system continues rewarding the same behavior continues for sure. That's why many culture initiatives feel energetic for a few weeks and then quietly fade away. The mechanism that produced the behavior never changed. That's the reason. I'm sharing fast diagnostic question here for you to help you with to diagnose issues quickly. These few questions reveal some patterns really fast. For priorities, what gets protected when everything becomes urgent? And what gets dropped first? For decision rights, look for where slows down. Where does progress depend on someone who is not close to the work? For consequences, what behavior continues even though everyone knows it should not? And for recognition, who is seen as successful in the organization and what behavior actually helped them to succeed? When leaders answer those questions honestly, the real mechanism usually becomes visible. What's creating that? So if culture feels off in your organization, don't start with survey. Start with signals. Look for friction, look for silence, look for drift. Those signals usually reveal the mechanism that's shaping the behavior. And when the mechanism changes, behavior changes with it. That's when culture actually begins to move. And if you need any help to redesign that in your organization, please feel free to reach me out. And thank you for listening.